lot of things that came together, and I feel like they were planting a lot of seeds, no pun intended, storyline seeds to play out over the next few seasons. But since we're only getting one season, we just have to go with what we have for now. We can only concentrate in the here and now and how things will play out over one more episode, right? Because after the first season ends, no more Swamp Thing. But anyways, I think the highlight of this episode probably is the first appearance of the Blue Devil, actually being the Blue Devil. It had been teased and people had talked about, the Blue Devil appearing in earlier episodes, Dan Cassidy turning into the Blue Devil. In this episode, he finally transforms and makes his debut as a hero. Quite a brutal hero too, because he wasn't just like beating up those guards, those security forces or mercenaries, whatever you call them. He was killing them. More brutal than the Blue Devil has often been in the comics. At least when the Blue Devil first debuted in comics, he wasn't someone who would straight up kill people. But, later on, they've made the character more serious as time's gone on. But, I liked how in this episode they made use of the blue fire effects. In the original comics, the Blue Devil, he would have a staff and he could fire blasts out of it. It wasn't doing stuff to people like it was in this episode, though. But that looked cool. I liked the blue fire effects. The way the Blue Devil himself looked rendered, he looked cool. He looked a lot more like an actual devil. The more he looks in more recent comics. In the earlier, Blue Devil appearances, he was just a guy in a suit, as they reference in the show, but, early on. But here, when he made his debut, he looked like an actual devil. I'm not sure where his powers are supposed to have actually come from in the show. In the comics, they explained it pretty deep, well, but in the show, it's like he just has these supernatural powers. I assume that will be explained as time goes on. Maybe, I guess, they only have one more episode to do it, maybe in the season finale. But, like I was saying, we aren't going to see Swamp Thing play out over multiple seasons because it's been canceled. But it seems to me like now they just have him with these powers, and they seem to have come out of nowhere. The Phantom Stranger is trying to guide him, push him in a certain direction, but, why is this happening to him exactly? The show hasn't said yet. I mean, why choose Dan Cassidy over any other stuntman, in the world who, could be doing this? What happened? But, I guess they'll tell us in one more episode, because that's all the time they have left to do it. Another highlight is, Swamp Thing discovers that, Alec Holland died, and it's really his consciousness in a plant husk, a plant body, which is what happened in the comics. And they took a lot of inspiration from the comics. They have throughout the whole show, but it was interesting for this one, they did it really well, because in the comics, Sunderland did hire Jason Woodrue to vivisect Swamp Thing so that the vivisection could yield, results. So they'd have data that they could use for their own purposes, which is exactly what happened in the episode. It happened differently in the comics, but, I think the show pretty much was faithful to the spirit of how it went in the comics. And at the end, the cliffhanger, Swamp Thing goes to the swamp, to the cove, and finds Alec Holland's, skeletal remains. Confirmation that the consciousness was absorbed into the plants, and that's why he is the swamp beast he is today. And, Swamp Thing is a mixture of scientific and supernatural forces. The show got that right, straight from the comics. And, they were going to say, I think I read online, they had planned on a multi-season arc or to lead into Justice League Dark or something, with multiple supernatural characters just operating. And I can see that here. I mean, we've got the Blue Devil, we've got Swamp Thing, Phantom Stranger showed up. Phantom Stranger looking more like he does in the comics, with the black hat and the black coat. They were very faithful to his appearance in this episode. And, I know I've mentioned in previous videos that that Phantom Stranger looked differently than I expected him to. But the Phantom Stranger does have the ability, he's a supernatural force, a being. He can make himself look different if he wants to. There's no rule that says he has to wear a coat and a hat every time he does something. But, since that's the way he often looks in the comics, that's how I would have expected him to look when he first showed up. But that's how he looked in this episode, and it was a nice nod. The saddest part of this episode for me was when Jason's wife, Carolyn, OD'd at the end of the episode and he found her. They're not making Jason look like a very good person on the show, but he does, I think, genuinely love his wife. His, scientific endeavors do pull him away from her, but he does care about her, and it was sad. I felt sad for her, too, But, I'm sure he hated coming home and seeing her do that to herself. But the only reason she did it is because, when Abby and Liz showed up earlier, Abby was reminding her, did you take your medication? She planted that seed, there I go with a pun again, in Carolyn's mind to do that. So you could say in a roundabout way, Abby's to blame. And I'll bet you that I'll bet you they'll write it so that Jason will find out that Abby had been there. And Jason will blame Abby for his wife's death, or I assume she's going to die, but maybe she won't die. Maybe she'll just be really sick or injured, but I think they're going to kill her off. And that will start him in his villainous, down the villainous path to want revenge against Abby and Swamp Thing and everyone. I had predicted earlier in the season that they would take that route with Jason, because I didn't see any reason for them to give him a wife on the show, except because Jason Woodward does not have a wife in the comics, at least not in any comics I've read, except to use her as a plot device to enrage him and make him, become a full supervillain, which is probably what's going to happen. He's going to blame the good guy characters for his wife's passing and be, dead set on making them pay. That's what I think is going to happen. They also brought, those of you who are really vigilant, who've read a lot of Swamp Thing comics, will notice that they brought back Dennis Barkley in this episode. He was only in there for a second. He was the guy who was with Avery, who declared, Maria insane or whatever, and to be put away in that home or that locked up in an institution. He was the one, with the most speaking lines in that scene. And in the comics, Dennis Barkley was a doctor who worked for Avery Sunderland, who became an ally of Swamp Thing. He was an ally of Swamp Thing's for a while, 2 or 3 years. He was a main supporting character in the old comics. Later on, though, Alan Moore made him go crazy, and he had to be killed. So, that was the tragic fate of Dennis Barkley in the comics. In the show, though, I think they're probably just going to use him as just this minor hospital guy. Maybe he'll become more of a nefarious character later on, but maybe they would have planned that for Dennis Barkley in later seasons or episodes, but since we only have one episode left of Swamp Thing, we're probably not going to see too much more of him. Near the end of the episode, Matt Cable gets into a car accident after drinking, which leaves him unconscious. And that did happen to Matt Cable in the comics. Matt Cable, after having appeared in Swamp Thing comics for a while, he was a major supporting character too. He did have a car accident after drinking, having problems in his personal life, and that led to him being in a coma. And after that, things never really did get too well for Matt. I mean, he wound up being turned into a raven and stuff. So I don't know what they're planning on doing with him in the show, because a lot of Matt's backstory in the comics is not in the show. In the comics, he got married to Abby, and they were having a bad marriage before he got into his accident. And all this stuff in the show with him being a son of the sheriff and being, the long lost is the best way to say it, long lost son of Avery Sunderland, that's not in the comics. So I'm not sure what they have planned for Matt or for his character's journey on the show. It would have been interesting to see if this show was going to get more than one season, but it's just going to get one more episode, as I keep saying. So I don't know, who knows? But that was another nod to something that happened to Matt in the comics. Swamp Thing is very faithful to the comics, I think, which is cool. So there we have it. Good final episode, or second to last episode, the 9th penultimate episode of Swamp Thing, the first season, and of the entire series, because it's just getting one season. Good stuff. I like how they're having multiple character arcs for multiple characters throughout the show. As I've said, as has been evident for a while now, Swamp Thing is an ensemble show, and they're definitely I think milking that for all it's worth, giving many people on the ensemble cast multiple things to do. So, we were only getting one more hour of it, right? Next week's episode will be the last episode of Swamp Thing ever. So I hope, that they went out with a bang, that the writers threw everything into it to give the show a proper send-out. And it'll be a really satisfying finale. We'll find out. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like it on YouTube and subscribe to the channel, because I appreciate your viewership, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.